Organizations across the U.S. that handle classified information are required to put in place insider threat programs that help defend against insider threats. And there are hundreds of thousands of them, hundreds to thousands of them. Traditional management approaches to insider threat focus on constraints of users to detect misbehaviors, to punish those misbehaviors. We call these negative incentives. This project's about looking at positive incentives. These are incentives that can influence an employee's satisfaction with the organization, and whether these kind of positive incentives actually reduce the insider threat. So our goal here is to determine the influence of particular workforce management practices on insider threat behaviors, and we focus on two different types, or we look at two different types, as I've mentioned. Negative incentives we define as practices that attempt to force employees to act in the interests of the organization. Again, constraints, detection, and punishment. Positive incentives are about looking to try to attract employees to act in the interests of the organization. So a past study we did about a year ago elaborated about 20 different negative unintended consequences associated with these putting in place insider threat programs. And a fair number of these, about 2/3, were results of negative incentives, kind of unintended results of negative incentives. And so this motivates our need to look at both of these in combination. And our basic belief here is not that we don't call them negative incentives to be derogatory, but that we need a balance. So we're looking at, well, what is the right mix, balance of positive and negative incentives to build these programs? Explicitly, organizations need to explicitly consider both types of incentives, and with the goal of producing a net positive for employees and the organization as well. Our scope here initially was an exploratory effort. We were trying to demonstrate the value of research in this area to insider threat reduction. And we were focusing on disgruntlement-spurred insider threats. So our belief is that there are three dimensions here to aligning employees and organizations: people, job, and organization. From the people perspective, we can talk about connectedness at work and focus on team building. We can focus on job rotation, things that help people interrelate personally. From the job perspective, we can talk about job engagement, how vigorous, dedicated, and absorbed in doing my job from day to day. From the organization perspective, we can talk about perceived organizational support. That is, how much support do I feel coming from the organization, from my supervisors? How effective is the communication? How fair are the policies and procedures? These sorts of things. So we think these three dimensions here really help make sure that the employee's interests are in fact aligned with the organization's interests and help ensure that they're resilient to engaging in behaviors that will harm the organization. So we had two objectives here. The first was an incident case analysis, or trying to answer the question, how engaged, connected, and supported are insider threat actors? So looking at the bad guys from our database. From looking at organizations generally, we did a survey, or looking at a survey there and asking the question, focusing specifically on this notion of organizational support. How much does that organizational support influence insider cyber misbehaviors? And there has been past research done in this area. Our research builds on and extends this in two ways. First, we're asking about more egregious insider threat behaviors. So past work has focused on need to move over here, okay. Need to focus on cyber insider threat behaviors and the more egregious of those. And the second aspect is asking questions of organizations specifically trying to put in place insider threat programs. So I guess I'll look over here. So our case study analysis. Again, how engaged, connected, and supported are the insider threat actors? So our method here, we were trying to leverage existing research as much as possible. We had 5-point Likert scales for each of these dimensions and asked questions in existing instruments for job engagement, connectedness at work, and perceived organizational support. So this shows one of the 5-point scales. It ranges on the negative side from negative attitudes about engagement and job, for instance, and on the positive side to being engaged in their job. The challenge here, of course, while we have a database of 1,300 insiders that have done bad things, many of them criminal, the challenge here is getting rich enough information in order to be able to answer these questions without a specific interview. And we didn't usually have interviews. It was usually court documents, media reports, and that sort of stuff, that sort of thing. But some of the cases had very rich data, and we picked 3 of those very richly supported data incidents and asked these questions along these 3 dimensions. And it turned out that for these 3 cases, organizational support was the most strongly in all 3 incidents, while job engagement was negative in only 2 out of 3, and connectedness at work was only 1 out of 3. While this is not a lot of data to go on, remember this is an exploratory, as we were looking at these rich sources of data, it became apparent that perceived organizational support was a foundation. And if you didn't have that foundation in place, then engagement at work or connectedness with coworkers didn't matter all that much with regard to whether they were going to engage in that behavior. So this gave us an initial focus on perceived organizational support going into our surveys. This turns out to be consistent with existing theory, in particular social exchange theory, which talks about the norm of reciprocity. Basically, there's positive reciprocity and negative reciprocity. If you treat me well, I'll treat you well. But if you treat me poorly, then I'll respond in the same. So the organizational survey came. We surveyed an information sharing group. It's called the Insider Threat Information Sharing Group, and there were about 90 organizations here. We surveyed this group because this is generally a hard population to reach. So this was a population that we were leading kind of monthly phone calls with. So it was a pretty big group, but we decided, well, this will be a good group to talk with where they're actively trying to put in place these insider threat programs. So again, we used the established 5-point scales for perceived organizational support. And we developed a 5-point frequency scale for cyber misbehavior based on our case data. So there were 22 questions on cyber misbehaviors and 36 questions on perceived organizational support. 25 responded. You can see the results here out of 23 that were usable for this, showing a fairly negative slope in terms of the correlation. That is, as perceived organizational support goes up on this 5-point scale, insider misbehavior frequency is going down. So this gave some credence to our thoughts and our hope that organizational support could be a lever in terms of being able to influence or to lower the rates of insider threat in organizations. We developed a model. So this is a system dynamics model that talks about satisfaction in organizations. So you see a box, employees satisfied with the organization's flows to be dissatisfied, ultimately to be potentially disgruntled, some of them, and ultimately on the far right to become incidents. So that's the most egregious types of behavior. And we use data from existing annual surveys of U.S. government workforce attitudes that said 55% of the government workforce is satisfied, 45% is dissatisfied, and about 18% rises to the level of higher level of disgruntlement. They call it active disengagement in the literature. But that was close enough to what we were talking about here in terms of disgruntlement. And while people can move between these boxes, right, the levels stay fairly consistent over the last 5 or 6 years. So we used that data and built a model on that. Our survey and case analysis work helped validate the structure of the model. And we used data from existing surveys. And we had various levels. For instance, there's 2 levels here in the simulation. One which talks about the percent disgruntled starting to attack, here at 0.2%. So it's pretty small. These are this model is representing fairly egregious type of activities. And the baseline level is the blue line, shows over 20 years there were 6 of these egregious insider attacks, about 1 every 3 1/3 year. So with 50% improvement, that's the simulation line 2, we see a cutting in half of that rate. So it's not a silver bullet. We argue that you need the combination of positive and negative incentives, but there's a lot you can do with just creating greater satisfaction in the workforce. Of course, these input parameters we're unsure about those. How much actual improvement can you get here? What are the percentages of people starting to attack? There's some uncertainty there. We can do Monte Carlo simulations to show, well, if we vary these 2 parameters in particular, it shows the range of insider incidents after 20 years. And at the top of that range, if there's 0.5% disgruntled starting to attack, that moves from 16 over the 20 years down to about 4. But the uncertainty, the simulation allows you to investigate that uncertainty and say, oh, well, where am I likely to be as an organization? And there are other uses for this model as well. For instance, we can actually use the model to calculate the cost savings associated with putting in place these positive incentives from the perspective of having fewer incidents and less counterproductivity, since satisfaction with an organization is related to counterproductivity. In terms of our future research in this area, as I mentioned, our current work is focused on correlation. It found those negative correlations. It's not generalizable to a larger population yet because of the limited sampling. But we think the next best approach would be to really focus in on the cause-effect relationship between, for instance, perceived organizational support and insider threat, and show there's a negative cause there. In terms of technology, here's a place where social science can influence insights into technology. We might ask, well, maybe we need to detect conditions within an organization that are likely to increase the levels of insider threat for that organization. And we can also detect insider alienation within the organization by identifying those at-risk behaviors and indicative aspects associated with the insiders, changes in the insiders' network of relationships within the organization. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is moving this to practice. So we can ask the question, well, what does this mix of positive and negative incentives mean? What does that mean for a particular organization? And how can we transition an organization from its current state to one with a better balance of those incentives? We have white papers that kind of flesh out the details on these various aspects. So last slide. is our vision. So on the left, you see a traditional security approach for negative incentives involved with restrictions on users, monitoring, and sanctions. We want to combine that with a security through positive incentives that are founded in organizational support, but build on that through connectedness with coworkers and job engagement, and give us a better balance of both a positive form of deterrence as well as a negative form. And I think I mentioned those benefits in the past: fewer unintended consequences, benefits for employees' satisfaction, fewer incidents, misbehaviors, and lower costs, both from the investigation perspective and the productivity loss due to the counterproductive behaviors. Have no time for questions. So.